Alright, this is where we left off. And I'm going to try recording in this classroom. I recorded this morning, but my phone pooped out. I don't know why. I didn't get that on YouTube yet. But what I want to do is just to take you through the sensory and motor pathways you're supposed to know for the next exam. And the style that I teach it is just to follow the different cells all the way up to the brain. You start out in the body, you end up in the brain, and I just go first, second, third neuron. That's it for the sensory pathways. And then for the motor pathways, I do sensory. I do upper motor neuron, lower motor neuron, and where everything is and where everything crosses over. So the first pathway I'll do is called the dorsal column medial lemniscal pathway. So that big long title is like right there. Dorsal column. Medial lemniscal pathway. And, well, medial lemniscal pathway is kind of mysterious, but I think you should know this. Dorsal column. Remember, columns are the white matter. Information is ascending or descending. And these pathways, named this, are conveying the sensation of discriminative touch and proprioception, basically. Well, discriminative touch, like tickle. Yeah, there's a touch receptor there. Sensation. Discriminative touch. So it's just about a path is following the three cells in series, the three cells in a row. Start with the one with the touch receptor. Okay, the first neuron, let's call it. For all of these first neurons in the sensory pathways, the cell body is in the posterior root ganglion. And if you follow it, that first cell is going to ascend in the dorsal area of the white matter, hence the dorsal column in the name. Now, there's a couple terms there as that extends. Now it depends. If it's information from the lower limb or information from the upper limb, it's going to use one of two pathways, either this fasciculus gracilis or this fasciculus cuneatus in the dorsal region here. So, still in the first neuron, I'm saying info ascends in the fasciculus gracilis or fasciculus cuneatus. One of those two, that one or that one. Those fancy names are in the dorsal region. And the information has not crossed over yet, so the information ascends in these areas ipsilateral. I'll write that here. So if you follow those two dark blue lines all the way up, and then you get to the medulla. Let me zoom in a little bit. In the medulla, you see the axon terminal of the first neuron, and basically that's where synapse is. I'll say synapses onto the second neuron in the medulla. So now we can follow the second neuron. What you see in the picture is the second neuron will then cross over, will decussate in the medulla. Decussates in medulla. It's gonna now the information is ascending contralateral. Started on one side, now it's on the other. And if you follow the contralateral ascension all the way up through the different parts of the brain, you follow it up all the way to the third neuron, which is in the thalamus inside the brain. Okay. Synapses in thalamus. Okay, so that's where you get the third neuron. So the third neuron, the cell body, is in the thalamus, and it'll project the correct sensory information. It'll route it to the right part of the cerebral cortex. Call it the sensory cortex. Third neuron. It's in the thalamus. Projects. I'll say it projects to the correct area of sensory cortex. Oops. And that takes, just milliseconds to get there. And that's it. You followed up the nerve pathway from the first cell in the periphery all the way up to the third cell in the brain, and it projected to the right part of the sensory cortex. And so this is kind of how we talk about it in terms of the sensation of discriminative touch. Now I'm going to go back to another pathway. But before I do, it's useful to ask if you knew what I was doing. You took notes, good. You know what I was doing. Okay, I mean, it's like, so you're like, well, what do I do with this information? Well, you have to know the pathway for the exam. This is how you study it. So I basically gave you the information of how I think you should study it. Know where the information is, ipsilateral, contralateral. Know the names of all the areas of where the cell is. Okay, and that's pretty much it. Now, proprioception is different. It doesn't have 3 cells to get to where it needs to go. It only has 2. And it's called spinocerebellar pathway. Rates this one. Let's see. So if you look on this side, there's a muscle spindle, and the first neuron is the same as before. It's in the posterior root ganglion, but it's going to synapse immediately onto a second neuron in the dorsal horn. So I'm just writing synapses and dorsal horn. So now you already are at the second neuron. The second neuron ascends ipsilateral. All the way to the destination. It's going to go all the way, not to the brain, to the cerebellum. Follow the light blue line, and notice it's ascending in what's called the lateral column. Okay? That light blue line is in the lateral white column. You just follow it to the cerebellum. I'm just going to go all the way up, and you see it there. It terminates. That is at the level of the cerebellum. The cerebellum is actually behind and below the brain itself. It's called the mini brain sometimes, or the behind brain. So I'll say it terminates in cerebellum. So that pathway is easier. There's not a third one that projects. It's basically, that's it. It's a sensation of proprioception. The last sensory information I want to do is the one for pain and temperature. A little different. It's called this, well, look at it here. Spinal thalamic pathway. This is for pain and temperature. So this pathway, what you're doing is, the first neuron, as you can see there, the example they give is, I guess, light a match to the bottom of the foot. Obviously, that's temperature. It could be painful too, I guess. Well, anyways, you see the three nerve endings there. So the first neuron, again, in posterior root ganglion. It synapses in the dorsal horn. And what it does is, the second one will cross over right then at the spinal cord. Second neuron crosses over, decussates in spinal cord. Then it's going to ascend contralateral. Okay. Ascends contralateral. So let's follow the second neuron all the way up contralaterally, all the way through medulla, all the way up through pons, all the way up, all the way up, all the way up, all the way up. And finally, the second neuron will synapse in the thalamus like before. So I'll just say ascends contralateral to thalamus.
So when you say the second neuron crosses over, that's still decussates, right?
Yeah. I just didn't say decussate that time. Yeah, you're correct. Okay. When it gets to the thalamus, it synapses. So that's the synapse to the third neuron. And the third neuron, just like before, will project to the correct area of sensory cortex. All right, done with sensory. And so you got the notes, and I think what you should do to check for your understanding after you've spent some time studying those pathways, I wrote some review questions, and they may not be in the study guide. These are the kinds of things to prove to yourself, oh yeah, I'm kind of getting this. You know, where's the soma of the first neuron? Where does the decussate? After decussation, the pathway is, you know. So I asked you some basic comprehension questions, see if you're kind of tracking. The motor pathways, that's spinocerebellar. The motor pathway shown here. So there's a few images shown here. The image on the right is where I'm going to map out the pathway. But I wanted to show you that top left picture of the brain. They kind of like superimpose body parts over parts of the brain. If it's red, what does that refer to? Sensory or motor? Motor. That means that part of the cortex, the voluntary action, controls those body parts. So that's the part of the brain that controls those body parts. And it's kind of disproportionate. You have more cortex devoted to controlling face stuff. Same thing for sensory. Instead of motor, it's sensory, so general senses. You have more cortex devoted to feeling things in the hand as opposed to your heel. So that's the cortex. And then you have pictures like this. Ascending and descending tracts. They're just kind of highlighting the motor and sensory information in the spinal cord. And I taught you some of them, like these. Dorsal white column, right? Or if it's a red area, that's information is not going up, it's going down through this segment. So those pictures are in your book too. But this picture will teach us the two motor pathways I want you to know. They are cortical spinal tracts. They're motor commands. There's the ventral and lateral. Okay. There's two lines there. There's a purple and a red. Let's follow the red line all the way down. So for this one, we start in the brain because motor commands are voluntary movement. The voluntary movement, the pathways are called cortical spinal tracts. Now whenever you see the prefix cortico, it means cortex. It means brain. I've come to realize that over the years. Cortico means brain, basically. The cerebral cortex, cortico. So the information starts there and it goes down to the spinal cord. So follow that upper motor neuron. It's in the cortex. This is called the ventral cortical spinal tract. So that first cell is called the upper motor neuron in the cortex. So that's where you start, and the information descends. It descends ipsilateral. And let's kind of look where it crosses over. So you follow it down from the brain, follow the red line, not the purple line. It goes down through the midbrain, the cerebellum, the medulla. It keeps on going down the spinal cord, and if you'll notice, it descends ipsilateral all the way to the correct segment of the spinal cord. So descends ipsilateral to correct segment of spinal cord. Then it crosses over. You can see it uses the commissure to decussate. Then it synapses, and it synapses on the lower motor neuron in the ventral horn. So it decussates, synapses in ventral horn. So that's the upper one. Then now you have the lower one, lower motor neuron. Well, basically, you can just follow that out. The lower motor neuron will basically innervate the muscle fibers. It's in the ventral horn, right? In ventral horn. The cell body is in the ventral horn, but the axon leaves the central nervous system. Innervates muscle fibers. We call that a motor unit, right? That's basically it. The other track is very similar, except it just crosses over to a different place. The other one is called a lateral corticospinal tract. So to take you through that, I just have to change a few words here. Instead of ventral, it's lateral. And follow it down. Goes through the midbrain. And there is one term I should add. It's called the cerebral peduncle. I could have said it for this one too, but I just added in. The cerebral peduncle is important for these corticospinal tracts. So it's an important structure in the midbrain, because if you damage that, you lose motor movement. Okay. So I would add info descends ipsilateral through cerebral peduncle that's of the midbrain. Just one more thing to take note of. And it keeps going down. Follow the purple line, not the red line. And when it gets to the medulla, that's where this pathway crosses over. It decussates. You can see that purple line cross over at the medulla. So at medulla, the cell decussates, and then it continues to descend contralateral. Okay, you can see why it's called lateral, because that's the lateral column of the white matter. Descends contralateral. So we'll just follow it all the way down now. What you see there, that purple cell, that's the upper motor neuron. It's synapsing onto an interneuron, which then synapses onto the lower motor neuron. That's at the correct level of spinal cord. So I'll continue over here. Synapses onto an interneuron. At the correct segment of spinal cord. And, well, the interneuron will synapse onto the lower motor neuron. Then you're done. So you can follow that lower motor neuron to the muscle fibers, and that's pretty much like the last time. Kind of a painstaking process to go through those, but that's the physiology part of this class. You have to learn the neural pathways that are known. There are some questions you can ask yourself. There's the figures I showed you before. Just you can study, and I thought this was a good emphasis that I teach these pathways separately, sensory and motor, but they're always happening at the same time. Like when you take notes, you write. You can feel the pen in your hand and you writing, and you actually writing is a motor command. So they kind of work in conjunction, parallel with each other. Spinal cord trauma, there's a figure in the atlas that kind of talks about it. I thought I'd mention it. So the idea is a lot of these cell bodies are in the spinal cord, right, or the brain. So it says if you transect or have a lesion, a spinal cord injury at any level inferior to that, you lose the function because the brain is now disconnected. So if you have, say, a cervical cord lesion, okay, you don't know this yet, but the spinal nerve roots that control the upper limb are C5, 6, 7, 8, and T1. Okay, should write that down. C5, C8, as well as T1. Those are the nerve roots that control upper limb. So basically that's in the neck region. It's called the brachial plexus. We'll study it. So if you have an injury at that level or superior to it, well, the brain can't communicate from everything inferior to that, so you might be confined to a wheelchair. You lose control of all four limbs. Loss of voluntary control of four limbs. If you transect from, well, I guess around the level of T1, L1 or below, because remember T1 is the bottom border of the upper limbs, so if you're inferior to that, then you'd probably have most function of upper limbs but not lower limbs. So T1, L1, the lesion there, loss of voluntary control of two lower limbs. And inferior to that, maybe you could still walk, or maybe you just need a cane. But the concept is you lose the function of the cell bodies, you don't get it back. These neurons, they don't regenerate. They're amitotic. That's why spinal cord injury is very serious. In terms of the loss of motor function, there's an acronym that can describe the symptoms called FLAT. Muscles become flaccid. They're basically denervated. They're not innervated. They're denervated. They basically, maybe you rip the nerve out. You have loss of voluntary control, atrophy from lack of use, and paralysis. That's typically what could be seen. So you have no control over them. The lower motor neurons are not functioning. So paralysis is loss of motor function, but you could damage upper motor neurons, right? They're in the cortex in your brain, but you have lots of lower motor neurons that still might be intact. So reflex activity might still be there. Now, reflex activity is not voluntary control, but because the lower motor neurons are there and undamaged, you might have reflex activity like, you know, tendon tap, knee jerk. So when the doctor does the tendon tap, he's testing for function of the lower motor neurons. They still work, but you can't control them because damage to the upper motor neurons, so that, you know, maybe a stroke or something. Loss of voluntary control, you have irregular stimulation. You might have this spastic paralysis where the muscles permanently shorten because they're always contracting and you have no control over them. So you have to think about upper versus lower motor neurons. As a lab activity we'll do Friday, it's called the 2-point discrimination test. I just want to give students a sense of like how the information is perceived by your brain based on the neurophysiology. And I'll explain this more on Friday when we do it. Let's see here. And I'll even have a printout for you. So that kind of concludes lecture for today. Let me stop this.